Everyone, glad to be here with you. Hope everyone's enjoying the milder weather. Nice to have a break from the heat. Well, as beings designed for relationships, a constant theme of human focus is what makes them work well or not so well. And communication is one of those ways, communication with one another, that is always near the top of that list. As complex beings, we communicate with one another in many different ways, and spoken words are one of the most common and frequently used methods in the communication toolbox. As with many things, though, frequency is not always an indicator of quality or effectiveness. A late 1800s American author named James Lyndall Basford wrote in a collection of wise sayings that many talk as easily as they breathe and with quite as little thought. Many talk as easily as they breathe and with quite as little thought. It's very true and well stated, as we all quite easily speak first and think afterward. Saying things that fail to improve on the silence, as one Spanish proverb has it, is a pretty common occurrence in our interactions. Thankfully, though, to help counteract this, God's Word is full of encouragement, admonition, and wisdom when it comes to the use of spoken words in our communication with one another. So in the remainder of the time for today's message, let's focus on a specific instruction from the Apostle Paul that provides a very helpful framework for ensuring that our words are helpful rather than harmful to those who hear them. Let's go to Ephesians chapter 4. Ephesians chapter 4. And we'll be focusing primarily on one verse here in Ephesians 4. Ephesians 4, verse 29. Where Paul writes, "Let no corrupt word proceed out of your mouth, but what is good for necessary edification, that it may impart grace to the hearers." There's a lot of depth in this fairly brief instruction and some profound implications for the health of the relationships that are largely a result of how we communicate with one another. Let's take a few minutes to unpack each of the three statements in this verse. The first statement is, "Let no corrupt word proceed out of your mouth." There are a few interesting things to note about this instruction. The New King James "no corrupt word" might cause us to think about avoiding the use of individual words, such as curse words or lewd terms that could be considered corrupt. But the King James translation broadens the perspective, phrasing this as "no corrupt communication." So it's not just the individual words, but all aspects of our speech that should be considered. The word corrupt is also interesting because, again, our first tendency is likely to think of it as indicating primarily the groups of words that you're not supposed to say. But again, the implication is actually much farther reaching. The word translated corrupt is the Greek sepros, which can mean rotten, as in bad to the core, but it can also just mean unfit for use or worthless, lacking worth. We can get some sense for how this word was applied from the well-known statement that Jesus made about trees being known by their fruit, where it is also used. In Luke 6, verse 43, it records Jesus' admonition that a good tree does not bear bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit. In the King James Version, the statement is that a good tree does not bring forth corrupt fruit, nor does a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. There are an awful lot of things that can produce fruit that is rotten, unfit, or lacking worth in someone's life. In the same broad sense, Paul was encouraging us to avoid the many things that can result in bad communication. One of the Merriam-Webster online dictionary's definitions for corrupt is to change something so that it is less pure or valuable, to make it less pure or valuable. We should avoid things that degrade the value of our communication. That leads us to the second statement in the verse, which urges us to focus on what is good for necessary edification. What is good for necessary edification. We often talk about the reality that spiritual transformation is a process of replacement. When we need to overcome something, we usually don't have the spiritual fortitude and strength of character to simply stop doing it. We have to both change our thoughts and behaviors and build new choices and habits and processes that replace them with healthier patterns of thought and behavior. Paul was a very practical advocate for God's way of life, and what he wrote advises us to improve our communication in the same way. Avoiding communication that is unfit and unworthy means pursuing communication that is both fit for purpose and worth immersing ourselves in. The benchmark set by Paul is that such communication should provide several qualities that are translated here as necessary edification. This phrase is very instructive when we unpack it because both words imply meaningful and positive outcomes. The word translated as necessary is used to describe something that is meeting a need and fulfilling a purpose. The word translated as edification is based on similar root words both in the Greek and the English. An edifice is a structure or a building. One who edifies builds. Edification is that process of building up. So when we combine the elements of this phrase, it means that we should communicate in a way that improves the hearts and minds and character of the participants in the conversation. This is a high standard to strive for because, like so many things in God's way of life, it requires an outwardly focused view. We so often, and I definitely see this in myself, we so often communicate hoping only for the outcomes that are going to build us up or result in the things that we are hoping for. Instead, our focus needs to be on building one another up with an outward view in a way that brings blessing and benefit to all. That leads us to the third statement in this verse, which urges us to focus on the long-term goal of having godly and profoundly meaningful relationships into eternity. That it, our communication, that it may impart grace to the hearers. This statement goes straight to the motives behind our communication. Why are we saying what we say? What's the purpose behind our speech? And what long-term results will our words have? According to Paul, the overriding motive for our communication should be to impart grace to one another. What does it mean to impart grace to someone? Well, we've talked a lot about grace in the past year with several messages focused on different aspects of the topic. And this passage uses the same word that we've been delving into. It's a wonderful word filled with hope and promise of something better than where we are, because it describes a status of favor that is not dependent on what we have earned or what we deserve. The King James Version translates impart as minister. Our words and our communication as a whole are meant to minister favor to the hearers, whether or not they deserve it. This is talking about an approach to life and relationships that mirrors God's interaction with us. Now, it does not mean that we never say hard things or have difficult conversations or set boundaries. But it does mean that whatever we say should extend to others the same status and treatment that we ourselves have received from God. Freely we have received the grace of God. Freely we should share it with others. The Expositor's Bible Commentary summarizes this phrase well, stating that it, quote, simply means to confer a blessing, whether physical or spiritual. The ultimate source of all blessing is God himself. The channel may be human, and so even the everyday conversation of Christians may become a means of grace to others. As we begin to conclude, I'd like to read the full verse again, but this time from the New International Version. This translation brings together some of these deeper meanings of each phrase as we've examined and discussed it. Ephesians 4, verse 29 from the New International Version. It states, "Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen." Communication is a pervasive activity in life, and as James Lyndall Bassford rightly observed, it's easy to develop the habit of speaking on autopilot with little or no thought invested. With God's help, Paul was inspired to outline a framework that leads to much better results. So let's use that framework to increase the value of our words, to ensure that they are a basis for building one another up, and to share them in such a way that the recipients receive grace as a benefit of whatever we say, just as we have received it from God.